Welcome back to Clarkston Lighthouse Guidance. I am Chandler Fleming, owner and lead therapist at Clarkston Lighthouse Counseling.
And I am Victoria Fleming, co-owner and therapist at Clarkston Lighthouse Counseling. In our show, we're going to explore psychological topics that affect us all: relationships, parenting, issues such as depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. We actually welcome your ideas and suggestions, so please feel free to go on our Facebook page and throw out some questions. We can have a show on that. But today, our topic is, ouch, that hurt. Dealing with criticism. Loaded topic.
It can be a loaded topic for sure. And part of what makes it loaded is really defining terms. What is criticism? How do we perceive it? What is something that might just be somebody's friendly advice? And what is something that kind of strikes at our core?
Absolutely, and even someone's background. And yet, as I was looking up the definition for criticism, the Merriam-Webster defines criticism as the act of expressing disapproval or of noting the problems of a person or thing. And the reality is most of us are expressing probably comments about things very, very often. Dirt roads, the
Sure.
Michigan bumpy dirt roads. And so it would seem by the very definition that there is definitely possibly a negative perspective that a person could take on it, that is expressing disapproval,
Yes.
is pointing out a problem.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's a great study that Gottman did. I frequently refer to him, he and his spouse out on the West Coast, and they did a study and they asked people who said they were very good at taking criticism and studied their brain activity. And people who said, hey, I'm great at taking criticism, their brains went wild. It was full of activity. The term that they use is flooded. They were pretty much overwhelmed with stimuli in their brain. And these are people who said they were really good at taking criticism. So it's important for us to recognize that we may not take criticism well, most people don't, and that the people that we're talking to, even if our intentions are good, that they may not be taking that criticism as well as we think they are.
I think that's interesting too, that even the people who said, oh, I take criticism really well, when that biofeedback was given, it did show more of a fight or flight response. And I do think very often when we first receive a criticism, there can be that tendency of, I either want to run or I want to fight. I want to defend myself. And so today in this show, that's what we want to look at. Criticism is inevitable. Criticism is going to happen. Most of us are probably giving more criticism than we realize we are. So we want to look at how can we effectively gain from, learn from criticism and handle it better in our lives. Yeah. So the first thing to do is, so a criticism has come and is to take time to reflect. If we do that immediate defensive response, if we do that immediate fight response, it's not going to be a positive thing.
No.
So, in fact, as you and I were talking about, we were very much talking about that manure and water. Could you explain when we were talking about that and planning for this, about that manure water concept?
Oh, definitely. I grew up in Northeast Tennessee, or I grew up in Michigan, moved to Northeast Tennessee, and lived in an area where there's lots of farmers. And every spring, they take the manure out of the barns and start spreading it over the field. Criticism a lot of times can be like manure. It can be beneficial. It can be fertilizer and cause us to grow. But there was a saying that they had, which was called hot soil. And hot soil was when you put too much manure on, and it would literally burn up the crops. And the only solution for it was to pour on water. When I think about manure kind of being fertilizer, I think of water being kind of love and positive and kind of the balance to that. So finding that balance is really important. And when we take time to reflect, oftentimes we can find the value or the nutrients in that criticism. And even though it might be stinky, it's not something we want to be around, it can be that fertilizer that makes our lives better.
Absolutely. That's what I was thinking, is manure definitely has a stench to it.
Yes.
It's not something that we necessarily welcome. And when we lived in Pennsylvania, we definitely found that different manures had different smells and it impacted us differently.
Yes.
And yet it was so important to the farmers. It was a necessary thing for the crops to grow and for the crops to thrive. So in that time of reflection, what a person wants to do is just think gosh, what was the person's intent? Was it good or bad? Even if if the person's intent wasn't the best, is there anything I can gain from it?
Sure.
So take time to consider it. And it is perfectly okay to say, I'll have to get back to you on that.
Delay is an awesome tactic, and it's good for us. In that moment, we can be totally overwhelmed, but giving ourselves a time to kind of shut down. In the past, we talked about areas of the brain, and after a while, our brain does shut down, and we think much more clearly and are able to kind of react in a more positive way.
And that can be true with our spouse. It can be true with a boss, with a coworker. If someone has said something that elicits that, ooh, that stings, ouch, that hurts, it really is okay to say, I'll get back to you on that. And then the next thing is, particularly if it's a spouse or a boss or a coworker, someone who is expecting a response, who needs some sort of further dialogue about this, it's okay to say, I'll get back to you on that, but then actually set a time.
Right.
So that the person knows that they were heard. So if you give me a criticism and I say, I'll have to give that some thought, then I also need to be willing to say, I'll get back to you on that, and hey, how about we talk about that in an hour? How about we talk about that tomorrow?
Yeah.
So I know, as you and I have talked about criticism in the past, you've got 3 very distinct rules, 3 very excellent rules that you like to use to help a person deal with criticism. What are those 3 rules, and how do we use them?
I really encourage people to ask themselves 3 questions, and I call them the rules of criticism. And question number 1 is there any truth to it at all? And you really have to look. You got to sometimes find that tiny piece of truth inside a whole big message and ask, is there any truth at all? Then you ask yourself, is there anything that I can do about it? And then the last thing, is there anything that I want to do about it? And I frequently use the example of some teenager comes in my office, is having a bad day, wants to criticize me, and says, you are fat and ugly. Well, I got to kind of look at that, Is there any truth at all to it? Well, the fat part I can kind of look for. I can go to the weight charts and kind of find an outside source and say, yeah, I am in that category that's overweight. So there is some truth to that. Ugly, it's kind of hard to define. Could be somebody's opinion, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So kind of taking a look at the ugly one, I can say, I kind of try to take good care of myself. And then the next thing is there anything I can do about it? Well, I can diet. That's definitely a way of improving my weight, is going on a diet and working through it that way. And then the last question is there anything I want to do about it? And sometimes it's not a firm yes or no. I want to diet. I diet periodically, but do I want it enough to actually be successful in a prolonged period of time? That's hard to tell. But oftentimes when we ask ourselves those questions, it can be an advantage. It's kind of interesting. My enemies have probably helped me more in growth than my friends have. And that's a strong statement, but my enemies unrestricted just told me all my horrible qualities. And being able to look at that and say, is there any truth to that, really was a gift. Not a gift that they were meaning to give, but a gift that allowed me to look at myself and say, there might be some truth to that. I need to reflect on that. Mm-hmm. That might be something I'm going to change. Boy, that is something I have changed.
And I do. I appreciate the fact that what was intended for perhaps harm,
yes,
that what was intended to hurt you with an enemy, you actually took the opportunity to say, gosh, okay, I'm gonna take some time to reflect on that. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna ask myself, is there any truth to this comment? Is there anything I can do about it? And is there anything I want to do about it? I do want us to linger a little bit on the anything I can do about it. What might be a situation where a person is criticized, but there's not anything that they can actually do about it?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of times we fall back to that statement of I can't. Mm-hmm. And there are things you can do about it. Very few things are totally impossible. And at the very least, we may be able to shape that other person's opinion. So it may not be true, but we may be able to, the best we can do is kind of work on that person's opinion.
Or I found myself in a situation where someone was giving me feedback about someone connected to me. They were making some very strong comments about, so-and-so in your life did such and such, and I had to look at the person and say, can you help me out, because I'm not sure what I can do about that situation. So that would definitely be okay, there was truth to it. I was able to ask that question and say, gosh, is there any truth to this observation they're making about so-and-so? There was truth to it, but there was nothing I could do about it. There's nothing I could do about it. And then I was freed from, this isn't mine.
Right.
This isn't mine, and I don't need to own that. And that's an important boundary for a person to draw when there is a criticism. Let's also look at a situation where if a boss is giving you a criticism, let's say the boss comes up to you and says, I told you when you took this job that you're going to have to put in at least 60 hours of work, and you are not pulling your weight. And you look at it, and in the very first question you recognize, there's no truth to that. I'm actually putting in 65 plus hours a week. You and I were talking about what would be some steps a person could do to not disrespect the boss, receive the boss's perceived perception that you're doing something wrong, that there's a problem. What might be some ways a person could deal with that?
You know, and one thing in general is listening for meaning versus listening for those literal words. And that's pretty important in all our relationships. You know, oftentimes people say things in a way that literally may not be true, but the message is still the same. So if my boss says, you're not working enough hours, and I told you you need to work 60 hours a week, I may be working 80 hours a week, but that message still may be true. The meaning may be, I'm not working hard enough. There is a problem. So we gotta really make that distinction between, are we listening for meaning or are we listening for those literal words?
That's
step one. And then two, you gotta recognize the power of the person. If it's their perception that you're not working hard enough, it may not be true. You may be working at 100% of your capacity, but you need to find a way to manage their perception. You might say, you know what, that's not true to me, but to my boss it is true. What can I do about it? Well, I can let him know when I'm at work. If I'm there before him, I can leave him a voicemail or a text message saying, hey, when you get in, can we talk? So he knows what time I clock in. So you can manage that appearance, and that's important.
Right. And I think that's an important part of criticism is our willingness to hear it. And we were actually at a football game, and it was super interesting because there was a player who had failed to fulfill the role that he had on the field. You could tell me exactly what the role was. I probably couldn't.
Okay.
But it was super interesting what the coach did. After this had happened a few times, and I could hear the groans of the crowd like, man. The coach actually went up and grabbed the kid by the helmet. Grabbed the kid by the helmet. He was a lot taller, so grabbed him and is like very clearly unhappy. And I think I probably made the comment of like, ouch, that must be hard. And I saw it as probably more of a negative, like, ouch, that hurt. And what was your take on it?
You know, I think my take was, wow, that's pretty intense. But it's a football field, and it's a football game, and it's a football player. And the coach was definitely trying to motivate his player. And I think what we need to take away from that is know your environment, know your audience, know your crowd. Some people are much, much more sensitive to criticism. And it may be based on their history. It may be just their makeup. Some people are far more relational, and some people are less secure. So it's important to really know where you are, what's appropriate. That same person in the classroom probably wouldn't get away with it. But on the football field, it's okay.
On the football field, absolutely. And he is part of a team.
He's part of a team.
And as part of a team, there are different expectations. I like what you said, too, about the fact that different personalities, because Gary Smalley, we talked about this, has the 5 love languages. And for the individual that has the love language of words of affirmation, so they're the person that their love tank is filled up by, good job, way to go. You know, I noticed that you did that. For them, words of criticism may be much more strongly felt.
Yes, definitely.
So they may be someone that the field would burn out more quickly, that the manure would be, a lesser amount would burn the crop.
Right.
And so they're going to need a lot more water of nurture and love and positive feedback. So I think it is important as well. But now that we've talked about the football, we've hit on that constructive criticism.
Okay.
And as we were looking at this whole topic of criticism, constructive criticism is a very important part in the whole business model. As we were doing a little bit of research, there's a lot of business models for constructive criticism. And with constructive criticism, we are looking at that process of offering valid and well-reasoned opinions. about the work of others, and it's usually involving both positive and negative comments. It's in a friendly manner rather than an oppositional or triggering that fight or flight. And the purpose of constructive criticism, like on the football field, it may not have felt necessarily like yay, but is to improve the outcome for the collaborative work.
Right.
And I think as we are looking at this topic of criticism in a marriage, in a friendship, in a family, at school, at work, it is a collaborative effort. It is a situation where, to use a High School Musical term, we're all in this together.
Yeah.
And having to, finding that ability within ourselves to not take it so personally and to just recognize, what, I do screw up.
Right.
I do things wrong, and there may be times that you need to say, Victoria, I would really prefer you not do that again.
Sure.
And I may have to say, whoa, that hurt my feelings,
Yeah.
and I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah.
But it's still an important thing. So have you found that to be true in your work force? Have you been in work situations where that collaborative?
I have, although people don't manage criticism well, and it's sad. I think of employees that you try to tell them in the most kind, concerned way that there's a problem, and they find the exception in what you're saying, and they become immediately overly defensive, and their guard shoots up, and they lose their job. Sometimes that inability to hear things in a way with positive intent, and being able to say, hey, what is the truth of this message? And being able to apply it in a positive way. What is one person's constructive criticism is somebody else saying, oh man, he really chewed me out. Well, the comment could be, hey, I'm kind of concerned you've been coming to work late. And then that person would go and say, hey, you're chewing me out. So we have to recognize that meaning is very important. And we all come up with different meanings. So if we're giving something that's critical, you got to know your audience, and you got to know that even in the best way, sometimes it'll fail, and that person's natural reaction will be defensive. And we got to know ourselves that if somebody's delivering criticism to us, is take that time, slow down, think your way through it, and see if there's an opportunity. Again, I want to repeat, some of my enemies have given me some of the best tools and pointed out things that were most negative about me. And those things were gifts. They were opportunities for change. So you got to go through that process. You got to ask yourself, is there any truth?
So as we started, you said, ouch, it hurts, that criticism is bound to happen and that it's just a part of life. And as Chandler was saying, we've got to know ourselves. And something as we're wrapping this up that I'd like to encourage is, one, just start being aware of how you do receive criticism. I need to look and see, how do I receive criticism? Do I have a tendency to want to run from it? Or do I have more of a tendency to want to fight, resist, make excuses, and defend? Once I start recognizing which of those two I have a tendency to do, I'm going to be better able to reflect and to take criticism in a more positive way. The other part that I would encourage is start noticing how often you're making comments and I'm making comments that may be critical. I think very often we're unaware of how often we're making comments that could be construed as critical. And then 3, just that we would recognize criticism is inevitable. It is, we're very often on a team, and we're very often with people where our perception of something is different from their perception. And as those opinions are being expressed, it can be construed as you're wrong, I'm right, and that's critical. But that's okay. If a person is willing to ask, is there any truth to this? Is there anything I can do about this? Is there anything I want to do about this? And then come back together, and then the football team play better and win the game.
Yeah.
Then criticism is a positive thing. If
definitely
telling
can
the
be.
person you're putting gasoline in your diesel keeps them from wrecking their car, their truck, then criticism is a positive thing. So criticism in and of itself does not have to be negative. It can actually be, as you said, your enemy is giving you a great gift
Sure.
for self-growth and for maturing. So we hope that you've had an opportunity to recognize that criticism does not have to hurt so much. And we do thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any questions, please call us at 248-245-1809 or email us at guidance@clarkstonlighthousecounseling.com. And again, that email address is guidance@clarkstonlighthousecounseling.com. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for watching.
The views expressed in this show are for general educational purposes only and do not constitute professional advice on any subject matter, nor do they necessarily reflect the views or opinions of its guests or of Independence Television. If mental health assistance is needed, please seek professional licensed treatment.